prove, it's hard for opposition even to prove these kinds of things when government itself is not really answering their burden to begin with. Now, first of all, before I begin my speech, let us first refute on what the contentions of government whip had to say. First of all, he only attacks my extension by saying it actually doesn't give choices at the end of the day. Because we don't even have a choice just because we have these financial constraints. Yes, this is exactly why there is danger in prioritization itself. Because already pre-rebutted by the opening house that when you actually try to have prioritization, you actually increase the cost of another courses which are not being prioritized in the end of the day. And it becomes exactly why there is an important balance at the end of the day. You cannot necessarily say that these things are actually harmful. The second point that issue that they want to talk about is they want to enforce government responsibility. Well, if you're really talking about government responsibility, you cannot actually quantify these kinds of things because of individuals themselves. You have to actually answer on the cases and how you address government and government addresses society as a whole. Madam Chair and members of this House. Now, before I move on, let's answer first on my first issue on this debate on how and which way can we achieve actually better economic development. Juxtapose that and shuffling economy. Because what does government bench want to argue in this kind of sense? What does the whole government want? Because they say they want to uplift the economy by contesting by these kinds of proposals that are different already from opening and closing government. Because in which means we have to answer the question, in which means does economic development can be achieved? Well, government bench has actually failed to answer this question. Government has actually answered this question for them. Will prioritization of economic favoring or courses favor the development of countries or the people and society in the end of the day? We say from opposition that it is no. Why? Because the prioritization doesn't actually provide an equal distribution of need, Madam Chair. Why? Because there are already existing education programs that offer in society. There are already existing programs which is much ignored because they want to highlight these kinds of economic benefiting programs in the end of the day. That there are other courses in which you can actually learn in order for you also to have a sense of development. What happens here is you exhaust these resources further by prioritizing these kinds of economic purposes. Second, it will actually benefit and follow. It actually doesn't really follow that if you actually prioritize economic courses, that actually equals to better development. Because we have to consider what development is here, Madam Chair and members of this House. Development is actually an equality in which we want to propose. It actually doesn't dwell on the wrong way. But before I move on, let us rest your case.
Even if courses all offer quality education, if people do not have the money to pursue them, they will not be able to pursue them at the end of the day.
That is why there's wrong prioritization in the first place. Because if you give those kinds of subsidies, if you give this kind of prioritization only to economic benefiting courses, you actually ignore those kinds of other courses in which actually plays already a vital role in society. Talk about the example of opening a house, of closing house also. That there are already existing mechanisms such as maybe mass communication. How does actually also benefit also the economy and the development of the people? You cannot necessarily say or quantify that if you actually want to achieve development, you actually only favor this economic favoring courses just because you want to raise GDP or just because you want to have this economic, you just want to send these people to higher purchasing power or that not. Because you have to answer also the questions on how it also will benefit more of the society. You cannot really say because when we prioritize economic development, it's actually tantamount to success of economy. Because what happens in the end of the day? What happens if these kinds of things will happen under prioritization? This is where my extension comes from. Because it means of the boosting only one part of the economy. Because the boosting of one side will actually adhere to less development, Madam Chair. In which they didn't answer. Because it happens when there is exhaustion of resources. Because let us first analyze this and ground this to a better understanding. When you necessarily follow or you necessarily prioritize these kinds of economic favoring courses, you actually have these kinds of students, or you actually have a surplus of these kinds of students on the ground. You actually produce more of these kinds of students, and actually becomes more. It just becomes less job specializations on the ground. That means that there are less people who actually specialize in other kinds of jobs, who actually can favor also the development. This actually is also tantamount to how it affects also the industry, and actually how it affects also in the economy at the same level. This kind of their basically approved by the society as whole. Because they only understand and they only answer first. It's because our helps only to people who really want these courses, who really don't want these kinds of, who really can enroll in these kinds of courses in the end of the day. But what they don't really see is that they also marginalize and they also harm those kinds of courses in which they can actually, in which these people are also deprived of just because they want to boost the economy in the end of the day. Now, before I resolve my last case, ladies and gentlemen, they are talking, they try to say that by prioritizing a course will make another to be costly. Then why then nursing, even if it's prioritized, is even more costly compared to com arts? Nursing is a course in which is really expensive also in the ground. You have to pay for the jeep, you have to pay for the accommodation, you have to pay for the hospital, even to have these kinds of things for you to be prioritized. That kind of example is wrong and faulty, Madam Chair and members of this House. What does the opposition want to say in this debate, Madam Chair? It's actually wrong for you to quantify these kinds of things because you put them on the value, because you actually marginalize other courses just because you want to have these kinds of prioritizations in favor of the others. So it actually harms more people on the ground just because these kinds of prioritizations exist in the first place. And then we result by saying that losing opposition will answer better, or opposition best, or their paradigm will answer these kinds of courses better because it actually provides a better balance, a better way of society to move as a whole and not being marginalized and not being shown as given prejudice by government. Hearing that, losing opposition is proud to end this debate.